And we are seeing ICE presence here in Northeast Florida this week.
Right. Agents were spotted running joint operations with FHP throughout our area.
Evidence recovery log, San Antonio Resident Agency, 5:37 hours. 3 forged Department of Defense receiving forms, 1 bolt cutter carrying olive-drab paint transfer, 2 duffel bags holding $640,000 in bundled cash, 7 active-duty access badges, and a handwritten route card marked only with depot numbers. Those entries were written after the breach. The real story began 39 minutes earlier, inside a freight warehouse off Medina Base Road, where the lights came up all at once and FBI agents moved through rows of shrink-wrapped pallets stamped as vehicle repair assemblies. At 4:58 a.m., San Antonio was still quiet. A drizzle sat over the loading yard. The men inside Bay 4 were not expecting a federal search team, Army CID agents, and Defense Criminal Investigative Service investigators to come through the side door under a sealed warrant. The first room looked ordinary: packing foam, forklifts, barcode scanners, a coffee pot still warm. The second room changed the case. Behind a false caging wall, agents found military radios, thermal optics housings, trauma kit components, and serialized avionics parts that should have been sitting inside controlled supply channels, not stacked beside cash, commercial export paperwork, and civilian invoices from companies that did not exist on any approved vendor list. Then came the clue that turned theft into betrayal. On a folding table sat a binder of movement schedules tied to 6 compromised procurement contracts and 9 Texas area supply depots. Several pages carried notations matching internal military shipment windows. And 17 active-duty personnel would eventually be implicated. 42 illegal shipments would be intercepted. By the time the warehouse inventory was complete, investigators were no longer looking at a black market resale crew. They were staring at an institutional infiltration case worth $275 million. And San Antonio was only the opening scene. To understand how that warehouse became the center of a federal corruption case, investigators had to go back 8 months, to a discrepancy so small it should have disappeared inside routine logistics noise. On September 12, 2025, civilian inventory analyst Sarah Whitaker was reviewing a late-night reconciliation packet tied to a vehicle sustainment order moving through Central Texas. 2 shipment identifiers matched. The serial ranges did not. A batch of armored vehicle communications modules had been recorded as transferred to a maintenance staging yard near Killeen, but the receiving signature came from a contractor account in San Antonio that had no authorization to touch controlled military property. Whitaker elevated the issue through compliance channels. The reply came back in less than an hour. Clerical duplication, no further action required. 3 days later, Texas Department of Public Safety stopped a box truck outside Temple for an equipment light violation. The manifest described surplus packaging material. Inside were sealed crates labeled as hydraulic repair stock. Under the top layer sat restricted communications hardware, battery assemblies, and narcotics interdiction radios removed from military inventory. The driver, Kevin Red, carried a prepaid phone, a contractor badge for Lone Mesa Defense Services, and a routing slip listing 2 depots that had not reported losses. That stop triggered a joint review involving FBI San Antonio, Army CID, DCIS, IRS CI, and DOJ Public Integrity. The first theory was diversion by a single contractor. It lasted less than a week. Phone records linked Red to a procurement analyst at a sustainment office outside Killeen, a warehouse supervisor in El Paso, and an active-duty logistics sergeant assigned to convoy scheduling support. Financial analysts then found something more damaging: rapid transfers from defense-adjacent subcontractors into real estate holding companies, vehicle leasing firms, and 1 consulting account used by a retired master sergeant. Keep that name in mind. The paperwork looked civilian. The timing did not. And somewhere inside the military logistics chain, someone with trusted access had started selling the system itself. By October, investigators were no longer working a theft file. They were mapping an architecture, Search warrants, subpoena returns, and controlled surveillance revealed a layered network spread across Texas military-adjacent infrastructure. 9 supply depots and contract yards came under review: San Antonio, Killeen, El Paso, Laredo, Corpus Christi, Beaumont, Midland, a private transload yard outside Houston, and a reserve storage annex north of Dallas. Some handled parts, some handled paperwork. A few existed mainly to create cover inside the movement chain. Together, they formed a diversion corridor that touched vehicle sustainment stock, communications hardware, aviation electronics housings, field medical supplies, and controlled maintenance components. The money trail explained why the ring kept expanding. Treasury and IRS CI analysts traced more than $275 million in diverted military supplies and related proceeds through 9 shell companies, including Lone Mesa Defense Services, Prairie Lock Logistics, Gulf Anthem Procurement, Black Ridge Transit Group, Astor Harbor Consulting, Southline Recovery Holdings, Alamo Crest Materials, Sabre Point Warehousing, and Meridian Field Systems. On paper, they sold freight coordination, emergency sourcing, storage services, and compliance reviews. In practice, they absorbed stolen inventory, inflated replacement invoices, and converted government-paid supply gaps into private revenue. Then came the route picture. FBI analysts built a movement map from burner phones, toll records, fuel purchases, gate logs, and encrypted dispatch messages. 42 illegal shipments had moved through the network over 10 months. Some cargo was broken apart and relabeled. Some was routed through civilian repair yards. Some was moved with legitimate freight under altered barcode references. The common factor was access. Somebody inside the military logistics network knew when audits were light, when transfer lanes were crowded, and which procurement windows could hide a missing pallet until the next reconciliation cycle. That is where the scandal widened. Investigators confirmed 6 compromised procurement contracts, all tied to rapid purchase language and emergency sustainment exceptions. The diversion ring was not just stealing from depots, it was manipulating the replacement process that followed the theft, at allowing insiders and contractors to profit twice, once when supplies were siphoned out, and again when federal money paid to backfill the same shortages. The result was a closed corruption loop with active duty support, civilian brokerage, and enough institutional camouflage to survive repeated internal reviews. This was no longer a warehouse case. It was a military supply corruption machine. The mechanics were disciplined. That is what made them dangerous. The ring worked by inserting itself at the quietest points in the supply chain: contract modification language, transfer approvals, after-hours loading windows, and discrepancy resolution. A depot would report routine movement under one line item. A contractor would receive a lawful load nearby. An insider would alter a barcode group or receiving reference just enough to separate a portion of the shipment from the official trail without triggering an immediate alarm. By the time the paperwork caught up, the missing inventory had already crossed into a private yard, been broken down, and re-entered commerce under another description. Military goods were not the only target. Access data mattered just as much. Investigators found internal movement schedules, maintenance backfill forecasts, and depot transfer calendars stored alongside shell company invoices. That combination allowed the network to predict shortages before command channels recognized them. It also allowed civilian brokers to position replacement vendors in advance, making the corruption appear efficient rather than suspicious. Several methods repeated across the case. Controlled items were hidden inside mixed freight. Packaging was preserved to avoid early detection. Government seals were photographed and duplicated. Legitimate emergency orders were mirrored with false vendor packets. Retired personnel working as civilian consultants coached front companies on which contract language would survive surface review. Active duty participants handled the rest: internal visibility, access timing, and silence. What looked like procurement administration was actually concealment. By December, investigators had identified 6 hidden business layers inside the operation. One set of companies handled diversion, Another handled storage. A third produced compliant-looking invoices. A fourth moved money into real estate holdings, equipment leases, and cash-intensive service firms. A fifth layer managed contact between soldiers, contractors, and outside buyers. The final layer was defensive, people positioned to explain away anomalies before they hardened into formal audits. That defensive layer is what kept the network alive. Supplies can disappear only so many times before someone notices. Systems survive corruption longer when trusted people are already waiting at the complaint desk. At the center of the ring was Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Cross, a logistics planner assigned to a sustainment coordination cell with visibility into regional movement priorities. Cross did not load trucks. He did not touch cash. His value was timing. He understood where the network could steal without disrupting operations so badly that command attention would arrive too quickly. His civilian counterpart was Marcus Hale, owner of Lone Mesa Defense Services, a contractor who presented himself as a problem solver for delayed military shipments. Hale became the commercial bridge between diverted inventory and replacement procurement. When depots showed gaps, his companies were often waiting with substitute stock and fresh invoices. Master Sergeant Luis Ortega handled the internal human layer. Investigators allege Ortega recruited active duty participants, connected them to outside couriers, and used trusted relationships inside loading crews and convoy support channels to keep movement clean. Jennifer Cole, a procurement analyst working on emergency sustainment packages, helped route contract modifications toward companies already tied to Hale's network. Retired Master Sergeant Robert Vance, and now a compliance consultant, taught shell firms how to sound legitimate under scrutiny. There were others. 17 active duty personnel would ultimately be named in the case. Some passed schedules, some approved transfers, some looked away. But the most revealing detail was structural, not personal. None of these people acted like street smugglers. They acted like administrators. They used meeting invites, transfer codes, billing language, vendor onboarding packets, and distribution forecasts. That is why the case kept evading easy detection. The ring did not operate outside the system. It hid inside the paperwork that made the system run. The takedown carried the same logic as the corruption itself: timing, coordination, and no wasted motion. Operation Iron Relay launched on June 4, 2026. As during a synchronized federal strike window set for 4:30 a.m., command elements were split between San Antonio, Austin, El Paso, and a mobile coordination node outside Killeen. FBI case agents ran warrant execution. DCIS and Army CID handled military-linked evidence recovery. IRSCI and Treasury moved on accounts and property. Texas DPS sealed road approaches near civilian warehouses expected to move inventory before sunrise. The priority targets were not just people. They were nodes. 9 supply depots and contract facilities were hit with simultaneous document seizures, access log preservation orders, and digital imaging teams. Search warrants went active at the Medina Base Road warehouse in San Antonio, a freight yard outside Killeen, 2 storage sites near El Paso, a private logistics office in Corpus Christi, as a shell company suite in North Houston, a vehicle yard in Laredo, an equipment warehouse near Beaumont, and a consulting office in Austin tied to Robert Vance. The first arrests came fast. Marcus Hale was taken into custody in the parking lot of a gated subdivision outside Beauern. Jennifer Cole was arrested leaving her apartment in Round Rock with 2 laptops and a pouch of encrypted flash drives. Ortega was detained near Killeen after attempting to leave in a government-registered vehicle not assigned to his billet. Cross was arrested last at 5:22 a.m. after investigators secured his office access, searched his home, and recovered handwritten notes matching shipment windows flagged in earlier surveillance. Then, the operational picture widened. Digital exploitation teams pulled dispatch archives, signal app backups, invoice drafts, and internal spreadsheets from seized servers before word of the raids fully spread. That real-time extraction led agents to 3 additional storage sites and helped stop outbound loads already moving towards secondary buyers. By noon, 42 illegal shipments had been fully cataloged or intercepted. 28 individuals had been arrested. 17 were active-duty personnel or military employees with controlled access. Treasury freeze orders locked down 24 financial accounts and restrained $88 million in cash, vehicles, property equity, and business holdings. And still, the evidence kept moving. Agents recovered forged receiving stamps, cloned depot identifiers, false discrepancy reports, and contract documents tied to all 6 compromised procurement lanes. And they found export prep materials that suggested diverted supplies were not only being resold domestically, but positioned for onward movement through private freight channels along the Gulf. The arrests were the visible part. The real victory was structural. For the first time, the network lost its timing advantage. After the raids came the accounting. That is where the scale hardened. The evidence inventory included 63 phones, 21 laptops, 14 encrypted storage devices, 39 binders of freight and contract paperwork, and serialized component lists tying seized material back to multiple military supply channels. Investigators matched inventory discrepancies to 42 illegal shipments and confirmed that 6 procurement contracts had been used to mask shortages, justify emergency replacement buys, or steer payment toward shell companies already tied to the ring. Financial damage was just as severe. Treasury analysts reconstructed flows through 9 shell companies and linked $88 million in frozen assets to homes, commercial property, vehicle fleets, brokerage accounts, and stored cash. Beyond that, DOJ investigators estimated $275 million in diverted military supplies, replacement overbilling, and downstream resale value tied to the operation. That number mattered for one reason above all others. It proved the case was not a side hustle. It was an industrial corruption scheme. Readiness damage had to be assessed separately. Components earmarked for maintenance schedules had been delayed, substituted, or rerouted. Medical supply stocks showed unexplained depletion patterns. Communications equipment inventories required emergency review. Each missing item represented more than loss. It represented uncertainty inside a military support system designed to function on trust, accountability, and timing. The question was no longer whether the network had penetrated the logistics chain. That had been established. The question was how many decisions across that chain had been quietly influenced by people investigators still had not identified. The human cost did not arrive as a single headline tragedy. It arrived as erosion. At Fort Cavazos, Staff Sergeant Maya Ellison had spent weeks documenting why 3 repair vehicles remained idle during a training cycle, despite parts listed in the system as delivered. Her mechanics improvised around shortages they should never have faced. In Corpus Christi, a retired Army medic, Teresa Bowman, volunteered with a reserve support charity that received trauma kit components later identified as substituted, incomplete, or improperly sourced through compromised vendors. In both cases, the damage looked administrative until someone depended on the missing equipment. That is the hardest part of a case like this. Corruption inside a military supply chain rarely announces itself with spectacle. It shows up as degraded readiness, false confidence, delayed repairs, missing accountability, and commands forced to make operational decisions on paperwork that no longer reflects reality. There was an institutional cost as well. Honest logistics officers found their signatures sitting beside altered records. Civilian analysts who raised anomalies were brushed aside or isolated. Young service members watched senior personnel treat access like currency. Once that lesson spreads, the damage moves beyond a single ring. It enters culture. The scandal was not simply that supplies were stolen. It was that the system teaching discipline had been used to reward betrayal. Federal prosecutors unsealed the first wave of charges within 48 hours of the raids. The counts included conspiracy to commit bribery, honest services fraud, major theft of government property, wire fraud, money laundering, obstruction, false statements, and related military justice violations for active duty participants. Parallel proceedings began inside the armed forces for personnel still under command authority. Several civilian contracts were suspended pending review. On the emergency audits spread through the same logistics corridors the ring had exploited. Publicly, the numbers were stark. 28 people arrested, 17 active duty personnel implicated, 9 supply depots investigated, 6 procurement contracts compromised, 42 illegal shipments intercepted, $275 million in diverted military supplies uncovered, $88 million in assets frozen. On paper, it looked decisive. In operational terms, it was only the first containment line, because buried inside the seized material was a continuity file. Investigators found it on an encrypted drive recovered from Robert Vance's Austin office. The document was not a confession. It was a resilience plan. It listed alternate broker names, substitute storage yards in Louisiana and New Mexico, 2 prospective freight partners near the Gulf Coast, and draft language for replacement procurement vehicles that could survive if the Texas network collapsed. In other words, the people behind the ring had already considered failure and designed around it. That is why this case matters beyond Texas. The corruption was local. The vulnerability was not. Modern military logistics depend on speed, outsourced support, layered contracting, and trusted administrative access. Those strengths also create surfaces for infiltration. A dishonest planner does not need to steal a convoy. A compromised analyst does not need to move a truck. A corrupt contractor does not need to break into a depot. They only need to understand forms, timing, and where institutional confidence is thick enough to hide manipulation. The raids shut down a major network. They did not erase the method. And that is the final warning. The next ring may not look like a smuggling crew. It may look like a maintenance vendor, a consulting office, a subcontract administrator, or a familiar name already inside the gate. By the time it becomes visible, the damage may already be in motion.